How's it, guys? So today we're going to look at how I implemented the waypoint system slash positional system slash something like that, right? Basically, the way that Krazy Karts allows the player to know what position they're in. So if you're talking about your race, you might have like 10 players or 10 drivers in the race. How do you know if you're in position 1, position 2, or position 10? So you need some way to be able to tell how far along the racetrack you are compared to the rest of the players. And if you're further along the racetrack, then you would be in a higher position, like position 1, 2, 3, whatever. And if you are further behind in the race, then you would be in position 10 or 9 or 8 or worse position. So how do you do that when the racetrack itself isn't a straight line? So obviously you have a situation where, and let's create a simple sheet here. If you have a racetrack that's just a simple straight line, and player 1, let's use like a red color, right? And player 1 is over here, and player 2, and player 3. Okay, so clearly like player 1 is going to be, and this is the beginning of the track, and here's the end, right? Player 1 is going to be coming first, and then player 3 is going to be coming second, and player 2 is going to be coming third, right? Oops, that's a weird 3. So, and how would you tell? So obviously we can just see that, like, that just makes sense. But a simple way of saying that more mathematically would be, well, how far along is each player from the beginning to the end? And then clearly player 1's the furthest, so therefore player 1 is coming first. Player 3 is second furthest, so they're coming second, and player 2 is kind of third furthest, so they're coming last. And that's all very simple because this is just a straight line. So your issue here is that your typical racetrack isn't a straight line. If it'd be pretty boring if your racetrack was just always simply a straight line. So as an example, this is one of the tracks from Krazy Karts, and it's clearly not a straight line. Here's the starting position, and the drivers go around in this kind of direction, so following the cursor, and that's the direction I want them to take, right? Now there's a few things here that we won't want. So you don't want a driver to go in this direction, to go here, and then to kind of jump over here and then come back here. In some cases you might actually want that, right? Like you might want, maybe in not this extreme kind of way, but you might want maybe a little channel over here where the driver, if they're sneaky, can take that route instead of going all the way around. But maybe it's a highly risky move. Maybe there's a lot of water around there, and if they get it wrong, then it would be slower than doing the full route. But if they get it right, then it's obviously much quicker. So you might want that. I didn't, so it made my life a bit easier. That would make this whole system a little bit more complicated. But that being said, if we just want a situation where we want the player to go around in a particular track, then the way that I created a system to allow for that was, so I basically turned this racetrack into a series of geometric objects. And those geometric objects represent chunks of the racetrack. And the further along you get along those geometric objects or chunks of the racetrack, the further you are in the race, and the further you're along in the race, obviously if you're further than someone else, then you'll be a better position than them. So that's how you can work out positioning. The other thing that you can do is having the race split up, or the racetrack split up into chunks, is that if you are in one chunk and you move into another chunk, if that move is considered a legal move, then that's okay. But if it's considered an illegal move, then you can control the way that the player moves across the racetrack by like suggesting what's legal and illegal. So I'll be able to look at both of those things in this explanation. So the first thing that we'll do is just segment this racetrack into pieces, just graphically. So let me do that now. So what what you do, or what I did at least for this, is I used two geometric shapes. So the first one is a rectangle. Now this looks like a square, but any kind of rectangular shape. All you need to know about this rectangle is the two starting points, i.e. the two positions on the line that's closest in the race. So if you're going in this direction, it's going to be this line. That's kind of the closest to the starting position. So I take those two positions, and let's maybe use a different color for the positions. Use yellow. So there and there. The other piece of information I would have is the distance for that rectangle. And this gives me enough information to say, okay, the other piece of information you'd need is you'd need to know the ID of that cell. So in this case, it's the first one, and we all come from 0, so 0 is the ID for this cell. And assuming this is the entire racetrack for now, what would this mean? All right, it's basically the exact same as this example, because this is a big rectangle, and the further along you move in that rectangle, the further you are in the race, and the furthest person along the rectangle is kind of, I guess you could call them like the current winner, or position number 1 or whatever. So what do we have over here? We've got a rectangle, and we can say that the distance that each player has traveled so far is their kind of distance into the race, and therefore the further they are, the better they're performing. And so a very simple way of doing that would be to just say, for this simple rectangle, see where the player's position is, minus that off from the starting point of the rectangle. And if your rectangles are kind of vertical and horizontal lines, then that's very simple. You just take, in this case, the x coordinates of the player and minus off the x coordinates of the line for the rectangle. And in this case, we're going from right to left. That's simple. That's just the player's position minus the rectangle starting line x coordinates, and that gets you the total distance within that rectangle. And then you compare that to the total distance for the rectangle itself, this yellow line, and that would basically taking one divided by the other would give you the proportion through of that cell that player is. And if you bunch up some rectangles together, you can get through the proportion of a bunch of rectangles. So let's put in a rectangle here. Clearly that rectangle is going to have the yellow points there. It's going to have a distance of that much larger yellow line. And what we could say is that, assuming this one comes before this one, assuming the starting line started over here, for instance, then you could say, okay, any guy that's still in this cell, that guy would obviously be at a lower position in the race, or worse position in the race, than someone in this cell. And then you could compare, well, people within each cell, where are they in comparison with other people in that grid? And we can use that kind of the ratio that I just mentioned. We take the ratio of how far along in that cell they are compared to the total distance of the cell. And then you can just compare those ratios for each player. You could either compare the ratios or the actual distance itself. The issue with the distance is that if you have a different geometric shape, the distance is kind of, it doesn't necessarily work as well as looking at the ratio, which is kind of generic per shape. And actually, that brings us on to the next shape. There's only one other shape that I use, because these kinds of, actually I think it could work for any racing game, to be honest. But these types of maps work particularly well for this type of object that I'm going to represent now. And that's a simple semicircle, or arc. I don't know what the name, like, what is the name of a half of a semicircle? Some kind of geometric shape. To be honest, I have no idea. But anyway, you could have a full semicircle, or a bit of a semicircle, or even more than a semicircle, like going towards a circle. Though that object, whatever that object is called, the only thing you need for that is the starting point, or the kind of the middle, or the origin maybe of that geometric shape, and then the angle. So how far, so this would be 180 degrees, how far does that kind of semicircle thing expand? And again, this is pretty simple. In terms of the player positions, how do you know if a player that's sitting, let's say over here, is further along in the race than a player sitting here? So that's quite tricky. The way that I decided to do it is, which gives good enough results, is to say what is the angle that that player is compared to the other player, and the player with the further angle is the player who's ahead. So this guy that I drew first is going to be at a greater angle than this guy that I drew second, which I thought was a neat solution. It works fine. I mean, you do get in situations where like a player who is here, like theoretically actually looking at it on a rectangle basis, this guy's slightly ahead of this guy. But this guy would be actually coming in position 2 based on the angle approach. But I mean, like, you're never going to be able to tell that in a fast-moving racing game. And plus, who is coming first in these two? I don't know. Maybe this guy, because he's a little bit more around the arc. It's hard to say exactly who's coming first there. Maybe this guy's coming first. But honestly, no, I don't think anyone cares. Or no one would be able to tell anyway. And then again, because we have that ratio, right? So if you take the angle, whoever's further in the angle compared to the total angle, that would determine who's kind of in front of who. And if you keep it in that ratio form, then it's easy to see, oh, he's, maybe this guy is like 50% of the way through this cell. This guy is 50% of the way through cell 0. And this guy is like 90% of the way through cell 1. And that's a pretty easy way to see who's ahead of who in the game. Now, obviously, this cell is on the prior lap. So if you take the laps into account, if you take the cell number into account, and then you take the position within each cell, then you can say who's coming first, second, third, up to last. And that's all pretty straightforward. So that's the entire positional system that's used in the game. Besides from a couple of other little points, like what happens if they're out of bounds, set their position at what was the last valid position, and kept that as their position. Which I definitely do keep in mind what is the last valid position, because we'll be coming on to how I allow for like error checking in their, in their game style. Like whether they're making legal or illegal moves, which we're going to come on to now. So for instance, what I might have done for the remaining piece of let's just say this piece and this piece, how would have I allowed for those in the system, right? So here clearly we have a rectangle. Again, the rectangle positions are this position and this position, and the neat thing here is you can see some reuse of some of these positions, which tells us we're on the right track. And clearly this guy's going to go, I should have drawn that all the way down here. This guy's going to go to there. So we have this guy would be like cell 2, and then we would have cell 3 probably being something like this. Now, that's obviously not a semicircle of any description, but you get the idea. And that would be cell 3, and then we would have cell 4 would have these two positions. And that's what we could do. Another approach that we could take is, instead of making cell 3 look like that, what we could do is to make cell 3 go as a semicircle, and then make a very small rectangle. That is a terrible rectangle. And then make another semicircle, and then you have another rectangle. So the good thing about this is it obviously gives you a little bit more control as to like how your grids look and how each cell looks. But what it also allows you is then to set better no man's land areas or out of bounds areas, and that just gives you a little bit more control as to ensure that the player knows when they're in a position where you don't want them to be. So for instance, if you go into an out of bounds area, you can immediately flash to the player that they're kind of out of bounds, or kind of turn back, or whatever it is, right? Like a message to the player that they're doing something incorrect. And what I did do in the game was I said, okay, let's just say there's a player who was over here and they've moved out of bounds trying to cheat. What I do is I say, okay, the last area that you were in was area 2. The last cell you were in was cell 2. And if you go out of cell 2, we'll remember which cell was your last cell, so which was cell 2, and this was the position, say 60% of the way through cell 2. And if you go out of bounds, you have to come back into bounds by coming back into cell 2. And it could be anywhere in cell 2, that's fine. But you have to come back into cell 2. So the player, if the player carries on going here, that's invalid, and their position is kept at cell 2 over here, at 60% of the way through cell 2. If I then realize, oh no, I've made an error, I'm going to come back, and they come back through this way, and now they come back into the game here, the game will start to recapture the position at cell 2 70% of the way through. But they have to come back into cell 2. I think I actually made it that they can come back into cell 2 or cell 3, and the game would be okay with that. Like if they did a little bit of an out of bounds vibe over here and then came back in over here, I'd be like, actually, you know what? I'm okay with that. But any other kind of transgression, so to speak, I didn't allow for them to make. And as you can see here, doing the rectangle thing over here actually makes no difference using that. If you do the full, if you make this piece the full rectangle and make the semicircle kind of not have this rectangle piece in the middle like I did first time around, the system still obviously works. There's just no out of bounds area, but anywhere outside of cell 2 is out of bounds. So it kind of treats it the same way. So you don't really have to kind of make this additional rectangle piece. But what that does show is that the system can allow for complex structures by just adding multiple rectangles and semicircles. You can do a whole bunch of them, right? And in order to make any kind of shape that you want, which I thought was pretty cool. In this case, you would have this as cell 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And once you complete that, you just check where each of your players are on that grid. And an easy way to check whether they're in a particular grid or not, I mean, you could just do a simple kind of collision detection, right? You could say, okay, what is the shape of this rectangle? Where is this person? And do it like a collision detection. And you can do it against all of the grid pieces. And then wherever they are in the entire grid, then you know their position in the game. And then you can compare it to all the other players in order to get a sense of where they sit in terms of kind of pole position or whatever. So what I really liked about the system was that it kind of solved two issues at once. It allowed me to have a very nice way of capturing where players are compared to other players, which is obviously incredibly important for a racing car game. And the other great thing that allowed me to do was allow me to ensure that players didn't break the race course rules without me needing to erect barriers, right? So one way that games get around this is they will actually make a full-on barrier here, right? So some kind of like invisible wall or an actual wall or something ridiculous that means that, or like a mountain, you know. So a player literally cannot, like, they will bump into something if they hit that. And you know, it might not be a straight line, it might like have grooves in it or whatever, but that's one way that kind of a game will get around. So they force you to stay in this route by having walls, and I don't need to draw all of them, but whatever, you get the point. But we'll have walls all the way around here. So if you're starting here, the only way that you can go is in this direction. You could go backwards, and then that's the only thing that they would need to check against. And then obviously they would have a wall on their surroundings as well. And there we go. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted that kind of open feel to the race courses, because in reality, that's what the race course would have looked like. So I didn't want that kind of drama of having walls. And also because it was that kind of 2D game, having a wall, it would look very weird unless it was a 3D object. So yeah, I didn't want to have to add that in. So I wanted a system that allowed for like a wall-less world, which I think this kind of system worked pretty well. So yeah, I don't think there's actually much more to say on this. I thought it was quite a cool way of approaching the problem. I'm sure there's other ways that are way cleverer and better, but this was pretty quick it got the job done. And if you're looking to make a racing car game that has something that allows the player to know what their position is, which is probably one of the most important things in a racing game, if you want that, or you want a way to keep players within the race course bounds that you want them to be in, or you want both, then this system seems to work pretty well. And if you use it, just give me a shout in the comments below. Let me know how it worked for you. Or if you have any other ideas of like way better solutions or games that have used other solutions that work really well, I'd be really interested to hear those. Until the next one, guys, take care.